Hello, welcome to the Fairy Whispering Podcast. I'm your host, Claire Silverwand. This episode is a re-release of an episode that I recorded in 2021. It was actually the first episode I recorded for the podcast, and it's about the legend of the hairy hands. I've updated this episode with some additional information from recent interviews with podcast guests. One of them was Paul Rendell, who I spoke to for episode 44 of the podcast. Another guest who's going to appear in an upcoming episode is Kevin Dixon, who's a social historian. So both of them gave some interesting insights and extra information into the story. Please support the podcast by recommending to friends. See links in the description for all my links to social media and also how to contact the show and also how to be a guest on the show. I hope you enjoy. The Fairy Whispering Podcast explores guests' encounters with the other world of fairy and ways of connecting with this realm. From listening to messages in owls' hoots, finding a four-leaf clover, chasing rainbows, or inviting a gnome to dinner. I'm Claire Silverwand, a fairy whisperer, researcher, and your guide on this journey. Take my hand and step into the twilit woodland, where they are waiting to meet you. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 24th of March 1921, a tragic motorcycle accident on a minor road near Postbridge, which killed a 51-year-old prison doctor, became part of Dartmoor legend. The story of the hairy hands has often been rehashed over the last 100 years in various publications of Dartmoor ghost stories. However, I have my own version of the story, which was passed down through my family by my great-grandfather, Samuel Casely. I'm stood by the Cherrybrook Bridge on the road into Postbridge from two bridges, and this is mentioned in some of the accounts of the story of the hairy hands. I stood here with my dad. We've come to walk along this road and just trace the route of the accident that happened on the 24th of March in 1921 that killed Dr Helby and injured the two passengers, the two girls that were in the sidecar. They walked from the accident spot into Postbridge, so we're going to retrace their steps. There's a car just going over the bridge. Cherrybrook's really clear. I've never stood by this river, and the morning lights reflecting on it. It's really beautiful. I'm going to share Samuel's telling of the story as told to me by my grandfather Jim Casely, who was a young boy of 7 years old at the time. I'll also share some of my own research into the original newspaper reports of the accident. Samuel Charles Wesley Casely, born in 1884, my great-grandfather, was the pharmacist of Dartmoor Prison, and previously he had been working as a prison nurse at HMP Parkhurst. A few years ago, my father Steve and I visited Dartmoor Prison Museum, and coincidentally, the prison logbook that was on display was open on a page that had his name and signature. In 1920, Sam had moved his family, wife Effie and sons Jim and Norman, from the Isle of Wight to Princetown for his new post at HMP Dartmoor. On the day of 24th of March 1921, Sam was covering for Dr Helby whilst the doctor was out on his rounds. According to my grandfather Jim, it was usual practice for the prison pharmacist to cover the doctor's responsibilities whilst the doctor was out on call. In Dr Helby's sidecar were the daughters of the Deputy Prison Governor, Colonel Honourable Edward Gerald Fleming French, who he was giving a lift to. Mrs French, who were thrown from the sidecar, survived the accident with minor injuries. According to my grandfather, his father, Samuel, in his temporary capacity as cover for the prison doctor, went to the scene and pronounced Dr Helby dead. The girls, who were very shaken and bruised by the accident, claimed that a pair of hairy hands had grabbed the motorcycle handlebars and steered the doctor to his death. Samuel's involvement in pronouncing the doctor dead at the scene is not mentioned in any of the subsequent newspaper reports.
Always take anything that's written before you as being not correct, really. And then you go there yourself, and then you take into account the things that have been written, and then think, well, does what's been written make sense?
Yeah.
Is it the whole story?
Yeah.
Is it just what somebody else has picked up from somebody else and they haven't actually been there? You stand there and you think, yeah, hang on a minute. Surely they couldn't have come down that road, or they couldn't, or whatever, you know. I can remember some things in Normandy like this.
Yeah.
Where there was a thing happened and there was a vehicle, photograph of a German vehicle just abandoned, a tank had been abandoned, all that. And you always took it that the caption on the photograph said this vehicle was coming from so-and-so and the American 1st Brigade, you know, encountered it or whatever.
Yeah.
But when I actually went and stood where that vehicle was, say it was like just abandoned there like that, and actually found a couple of bits of which were clearly metal from that tank that had been hit, shrapnel, you know, in the bank. And then I thought, hang on, and the Americans were supposed to be where? Well, they couldn't even see that vehicle from there, like, you know, they must have been up there.
So what were the actual events of Thursday the 24th of March 1921? Who were the people involved? For this we can turn to the original newspaper report of the incident, which interestingly concurs with my grandfather's version of events. On Monday the 28th of March 1921, 4 days after the fatal accident, the Western Morning News and Mercury published the findings of the inquest into Dr Helby's death. Postbridge fatality, young lady's narrow escape, cause of accident. The two young daughters of Major the Honourable E.G. French, Deputy Governor of Dartmoor Prison, narrowly escaped serious injury in the motorcycling accident near Postbridge on Thursday afternoon, which resulted in the tragic death of Dr. Ernest Hasler Helby, medical officer of the prison. Riding in the sidecar, they were thrown into the road with great violence, but fortunately sustained only shock and severe bruises. Hastening to Postbridge, about half a mile distant, the girls summoned assistance, and within 10 minutes Mr. Newman was on the scene and found Dr. Helby beyond aid. Having regard to their condition, the evidence of the Mrs. French was dispensed with at the inquest on Dr. Helby, which was conducted by Mr. H.C. Brown, coroner of Oakhampton, on Saturday afternoon at the prison. Just passing a little mileage stone saying Tavistock 11 miles, Warnhampstead 9 miles. I'm just coming to the top of the hill that goes down to Postbridge and down to the site of the accident, which is said to be by the gates of Archerton. Nature of the injuries. Dr. G.H.S. Hillier of Tavistock, Temporary Assistant Medical Officer, Dartmoor Prison, identified the body of the deceased, who was 51. On being informed of the accident, he went to the spot and found that the deceased had sustained an extensive fracture of the base of the skull, and in his opinion, death must have been instantaneous. He understood that the 2 young daughters of the Deputy Governor were passengers in the sidecar of the machine which the deceased was riding. As a result of the accident, they were both suffering from shock, were badly bruised, and not in a fit state to give evidence. The coroner remarked that he believed Dr. Helby suffered from shell shock. He asked if it has any bearing on the fatality. A witness said, "Not in the slightest. He was absolutely normal in every respect, but his nerve was not what it used to be." The coroner asked, "There was nothing, you mean, in his nervous condition that would indicate to you that he was not fit to ride a motorbicycle or drive a car?" The witness replied, "No, he has driven them frequently." Major the Honourable E.G. French, Deputy Governor, and he had spoken to the elder of his daughters, and she told him that immediately before the accident, Dr. Helby said either that something has happened or something is going to happen. Just as he spoke, they were all thrown out. Both the girls said the machine was going fairly fast down the hill. Braking the machine. Hayden Newman, Princetown, stated that he was speaking to the driver of a motor lorry at Postbridge when the girls reached there and reported the accident. He drove out in the lorry and found Dr. Helby in the roadway, apparently dead. On examining the motorcycle, he saw a broken part of the front fork, which, on giving way, caused the machine to collapse. When the engine struck the ground, it would necessarily throw the rider out of the saddle. There appeared to be no stone or obstacle in the road with which the bicycle could have collided. The coroner said he was satisfied that the deceased died from a fractured skull, the result of being accidentally thrown from the motor bicycle near Postbridge. Personally, he was extremely grieved at the death of Dr. Helby, with whom he was acquainted. They all appreciated his good qualities and ability as the prison medical officer, and it was awfully sad that he should have met with such an untimely end. This first newspaper report of the incident is important as it's the most accurate, and it cites natural causes for the tragic accident. However, what is the missing evidence of the 2 girls in the sidecar who were key witnesses to the accident? Behind me there's the edge of Belvoir Forest, and there's some deciduous trees on the edges. I think they might be oak trees, and they're covered in moss. The trunks are covered in moss, and there's lots of little faces and creatures looking out of the woods at me as I walk past. It definitely looks very dark and spooky in there. And behind there's the plantation of Belvoir with the pine trees. I just hear the wind going through the trees like the sea or a river. The girls were Valerie Violet Gwendolyn French and Essex Layla Hilary French, aged 12 and 14 respectively. According to the original newspaper report, the eldest of the sisters, Essex French, had told her father, the prison governor, that they were travelling fairly fast downhill when Dr Helby shouted words to the effect of something has happened or something is going to happen. They were all then violently thrown from the motorcycle and sidecar. There is no mention in this report of the girls witnessing hairy hands steering Dr Helby off the road to his death. It is interesting to read of the girls' evidence being dispensed with at the inquest into Dr Helby's death due to the state of shock that they were in. Did the story of the hairy hands originate with the two girls in the sidecar, as my grandfather's version of the story suggested? If so, could they have been influenced by local superstition that had built up around stories of prior accidents being attributed to something supernatural? Or did my grandfather confuse the later newspaper reports, which mentioned the hairy hands, with his father Sam's story of the incident? Through my research, I noticed that over the months that followed, the facts of the original incident were increasingly misreported and lost. Many of the present-day versions of the original story are based on the incorrect tabloid reports that followed several months later after the accident, which blew the whole incident out of proportion. It's interesting to be here, isn't it?
Yeah. So you reckon that his injuries, well, obviously just caused by coming off the bike, but
yeah, he
the wall or whatever.
He died from a fractured skull, so he probably wasn't wearing a
Helmet, perhaps.
helmet. Yeah. So I stood by the gates of Archton House and Archton Cottage. Interesting, just looking up the driveway and just looking back up the road to where, I hear the sheep in the background, to where Dr Helby would have come down the hill. It's quite a curve, there's a bend. He would have come down, and then the report says that, newspaper report says that he lost control when he was coming at speed down the hill. So along the wall of Archton House, it's quite a ditch, quite a big ditch along the verge. So just talking about with my dad about how he would have come down the hill and perhaps careered off and hit the wall, and the two girls that were in the sidecar would have been saved by the grass verge. They must have come out on the grass verge while on the tarmac. The first story that mentions the hairy hands was written by Mr. T. Gifford in the Daily Mail 6 months later, on the 14th of October 1921, coincidentally well timed for Halloween. I don't have access to this article, yet another newspaper report 3 days later, on the 17th of October, references it. The story was dramatically entitled "Gripped by Invisible Hands, Mystery of Roadway, Motorists Endangered, a Line Spirit Theory," and it appeared in the Evening Telegraph. The article cited the 3 curious accidents since the end of March on the same stretch of road, the first being the death of Dr Helby, followed by a swerving of a coach in which several people were injured, and lastly Mr Gifford's story of an officer friend who felt 2 large muscular hairy hands close over his own and tore him off the road in spite of his resistance. As a result, the young man was hurt and his bicycle damaged. The article goes on to query whether Dr Helby had met his fate by the same large unseen hands. It also mentions Mr Gifford's interest in psychic phenomena, and his theory being that the paranormal hands could be caused by an elemental or natural spirit, or of the earthbound spirit of some such person as a murderer. Following this report, Others began to jump on the supernatural bandwagon. A letter from Beatrice Chase of Widdicombe appeared in the Western Morning News and Mercury on the 24th of October 1921. Her letter was entitled "The Unseen Hands: Are Accidents Due to Magnetic Rocks?" Ms. Chase's letter mentioned how she had witnessed a coach full of passengers near two bridges swerving into the roadside. Ms. Chase says it was a long straight piece of road with no curve and no other traffic, and the coach was being slowly and carefully driven. She reports that the tyre marks on the road were almost right angular. I never saw such a thing. Beatrice goes on to query whether these things may be due to magnetic rocks, of which there are many on Dartmoor. She suggests that someone with the requisite instruments could test that road from the top of Merripit Hill to Archerton. Archerton was a private residence belonging to Sir Walter Courtney Bennett.
Dad,
It's a bit of headlamp glass. It's
found a
definitely
bit of, right by the gate of
BSA
Archerton.
1918 motorcycle headlamp. Just out of silliness, I'm going to take that
Yeah, that's a good idea.
because there's a bit of reflector down there as well. But I'm sure
Yeah.
it's not.
Oh wow.
Yeah. But,
Oh gosh, yeah, lots of bits of car
Yeah, that's a bit of car on the way.
on the road. Yeah, so now we could just walk down into Postbridge, because this is what the two girls in the sidecar would have done.
Yeah.
They went into Postbridge to get help. So do that.
The facts surrounding the original accident of Dr Helby were gradually becoming submerged in inaccuracies and ever stranger theories. In a letter to the Western Morning News on the 16th of November, George French of Postbridge, Justice of the Peace, addressed what he called the mixed bag of jumbled inaccuracies. He goes on to say how these inaccuracies have resulted in nothing more than a lively display of rustic wit and gratuitous advertisement to the potency of good cheer hospitality dispensed at the two hostelries which flank Postbridge. He goes on to say that the accidents were attributed on examination by competent authority to purely mechanical causes, which is true according to the original report. Mr. French, JP, defends local belief and perception of the unseen, which he argues has been quickened by the familiarity with the awe-inspiring forces of nature of Dartmoor. He adds, "Pixie-led we may be, and we have found the little folk instinctive guides." He ends by speaking of the hurt that such a tissue of libellous inaccuracies shown by the paper about the accident has caused the local community. Another letter from someone that calls themselves Old Dartmoor on the 18th of November 1921 writes, "Sir, we who live an honest and straight life on Dartmoor don't believe any such trash as is written about the road at Postbridge or the foolish talk going on as to unseen hands. Old Dartmoor goes on to explain that there have been many capsized motor vehicles on that stretch of road from Two Bridges Cross to Postbridge, and that it was a main road across the moor 30 years ago, which of late has been neglected and in a rough state, quite unfit for motor traffic."
Stood by the road bridge at Postbridge, by the water that cascades under the bridge. And on the right of me is the Clapper Bridge, and I'm stood on a little stony beach on the edge of the East Dart River, and so peaceful in Postbridge today. couple of people here and there, and was just thinking about the two girls, their journey into Postbridge after the accident, and the shock that they must have been in after the accident, and how they must have felt. They would have been badly bruised, just experiencing Dr Helby lying in the road after the accident and going for help in Postbridge. That must have taken a lot of strength and courage and physical strength, really, to get themselves together enough to make the walk into Postbridge to find help. I suppose driven by a sense of desperation, really. And they would have walked here, and then they spoke to a man called Hayden Newman, who, from what I can gather, was a motor mechanic from Princetown, and he was talking to a lorry driver when they approached and they asked for his assistance. And he was the one that walked back to the scene of the accident and inspected the motorcycle and saw that the axle and the front axle and a few of the spokes are broken on the motorcycle, and that's what he said had caused the crash at the inquest. That was interesting what you were saying about the last time you were here was when you were...
Oh, with your mum?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Boy.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that's the last time I've sat on that.
Gosh. So, nearly 70 years ago.
Well, not that long, but I was probably sort of... yeah.
How old are you again?
Probably almost. So let's say I was 9 or 10, so 60 odd years ago.
Gosh.
Incredible. And yeah, so stop at the Huntsman's Arms, which is just there. Like that, isn't it?
Oh, right.
On the way to Princetown.
Paul Rental, who's a Dartmoor guide, storyteller and author, recently shared with me one of the backstories behind the Hairy Hands legend.
Hairy Hands then, if you want.
Storytelling. Yeah, tell the Hairy Hands story.
In the early 1800s, there was a big demand for gunpowder for the quarries and tin mines in Devon and Cornwall.
Yeah.
An enterprising chap called George Freen from Plymouth built a gunpowder factory near Postbridge. Today the spot is known as Powder Mills.
Yeah.
So in the 1880s there was a chap working there. He lived in Postbridge. He went to work every day. He sat down before he started work and had his breakfast. But this particular Friday morning, this gentleman ate his breakfast, his midday meal, then his evening meal. And his workmate said to him, "Why have you done that? I've got a funny feeling I'm going to die today." He says, "I don't want to go to heaven hungry."
Oh, okay.
And they all laughed at him.
Yeah.
Anyway, they all laughed at him and they went off into the mill.
When
they were working in the mills, they would have to wear slippers because their normal shoes had nails in them.
Okay.
So they went into the mill with his slippers on. At the end of the shift, he'd come out of the mill, took his slippers off and put his normal shoes on to go home. When he remembered he'd left something inside the mill.
Oh no.
So he trots back inside the mill.
Yeah.
There's an almighty explosion and the poor man dies, but his hands get blown off from the rest of his body. And those hands are hairy. And they haunt the road between Two Bridges and Postbridge. And they grab the steering wheel of your car and pull you into the ditch. And that's the story behind Hairy Hands.
I recently spoke to social historian Kevin Dixon, who gave me his insights into the Hairy Hands legend. You can hear my full interview with Kevin in a future episode of the podcast.
We've been talking about the Hairy Hands incident.
Yeah.
I think it's about 1923, 1924, something like that.
1921.
1921, yeah. So it's that very, very early 1920 stuff. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that happened there, and this happened right across the country. But if we look at Torquay, if we go along Torquay seafront, you've got the War Memorial.
Yeah.
There's 602 names there. So absolutely every family in Torquay lost somebody in the First World War. So that moves into something people have actually called the morbid age. So you go into every home and there'll be one of these round brass plaques, saying lost in action. So every factory, every home, every office would probably have a little memorial. And then you had these huge memorials, these great memorials all over the place. And so you're talking about the morbid age. Society, I think, then kind of split. Anybody that was born after 1900 that didn't go through that war, they were coming to age. They were coming into their early 20s, and then you had the Great Jazz Age. And if you look at how people dressed, full length dresses, the whole Agatha Christie thing, the big fur hats, you might see their ankles. And 10 years later, that was 1911. So 1921. People took all their clothes off, and you see them on the beach. The legs are bare, the shoulders are bare, shorter hair. So that's one thing. That was the sort of the jazz age, the movies, all that excitement. The other side was what they call the morbid age, which was a real interest in the occult, in the supernatural. That was the second explosion of spiritualism in Torquay. So every night of the week you could probably go off and see a spiritualist, and do a séance. Yeah. So there's real interest in the afterlife and contact in the afterlife. So that shifted. The nature of the supernatural shifted as well. Traditionally, through the 18th and 19th centuries, during the 18th and mostly the 19th centuries, ghosts were somebody you'd know. They were a relative or a friend, and they were coming back and they were telling you things like, "This is where my will is, and this is where I died of somebody killed me," or something like that. I want help. So it's that kind of benign ghost. Then during the sort of First World, it started to change a little bit, but really during the First World War, you started getting the malevolent ghost. You started getting the nasty ghost. Suddenly, you get the angry, malevolent poltergeist that you don't know.
Yeah. And
one of the suggestions is, a bit like the Hairy Hands, the First World War traumatised people so much that they two views on this. Either it makes people more willing to, and more angry and depressed, and so they're more likely to believe in things, an angry ghost, because it was an angry, violent time, millions dead, of course, or it opens up something else, but that's up to your listeners to decide. And the second thing with the Hairy Hands is, if we always look back at what's on in the movies, in the books, in the televisions, because that always reflects and influences what people do. People see things they don't understand, and then they build a story around them. And there's a bit of a tourism thing going on there as well. Always look at, I call them revenant rules. Always look at where. Always look at who makes money out of this.
Yes.
Do they have an incentive, to embroider stories? Do they import stories from other places? Always look at that. What's going on in the movies? What's going on in the books? What's going on in the television? And going back to the Hairy Hands, the Hairy Hands thing came up. There was a movie called The Hands of Orlac, where somebody had his hands cut off and went round.
Oh.
Remember that?
Yeah, when was that?
The 1920s, just about the same time.
About the same time?
About the same time. So you and then there was all this trauma at the time about grafting hands on and all of that kind of stuff onto people. So maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah, and the spirit hands.
That's it. All of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you can mix up that. Now that's not saying that there's not a core of it.
Other stories say that the hands are that of a murderer, one of the inmates of Dartmoor prison, or perhaps manifestation of an ancient and malevolent elemental. There are many ancient remains in the area of burial cairns and stone circles going back to Neolithic times. Whatever the explanation, drivers have experienced being forced off the road into present times, reportedly by a hidden force. I asked Paul Rendell if he had any modern day examples of the hairy hands. Wow, and do you know of anyone else apart from Dr Helby that is supposed to have encountered these hands?
1982,
Right.
a friend of mine who lived in Princetown, Dave
Yeah.
German, told me a coach driver was heading towards Princetown
Yeah.
to meet him because he was a guide
Okay.
leading people. So he went to meet him, and this coach driver was heading from Postbridge across the bridge at Cherrybrook, and the driver said something grabbed the steering wheel, didn't see it, some force pushed him to the bridge.
Oh, wow.
The police come out, breathalyzed him, spoke to him. He said, "There's something grabbed the steering wheel. I was forced into the ditch." He said, "Do you know the story about hairy hands?" The driver said, "No, I'm from Birmingham. I didn't know the story. What are you on about?"
Gosh.
And he said, "Someone pulled him into the ditch. Hit that bridge, and that was it."
That's incredible, isn't it? Because it's easy to discount the old stories, you know, that were in newspapers at
Yeah.
the time.
Well,
And
yeah.
just think, oh, people are just the road and the camber of the road and all this kind of thing. But to hear it from a modern
Yeah.
day
1980s.
witness
Yeah.
kind of brings that mystery back into question, doesn't it? So in conclusion, are the roots of the hairy hands legend rooted merely in neglected roads, or something altogether more otherworldly? We will probably never know, and the secret remains with those two girls. Pranksters appear to have had one last laugh a few years later on Friday the 21st of September 1928 in the Western Times. A lover of Dartmoor writes in the letter column of signs either side of Morton Hampstead Road that proclaim "Beware of death by the hairy hands." The press must have lost interest in the story, as reports of the hairy hands fade after November 1921, with just a smattering of stories in the years that follow. However, the original story involving Dr Helby and indirectly my great-grandfather, its many versions and inaccuracies, has survived to become part of Dartmoor's paranormal folklore. And although my great-grandfather Samuel Casey's involvement isn't reported in the newspapers at the time, his name did appear in a version of the story which my father and I found in a bookshop on Dartmoor in Widdicombe in the 1980s, and we are now trying to locate the book in which his name was mentioned.
Off the motorbike.
We just
Great place.
found a bit of motorbike
So that's what happened.
on the road.
These are strange times. These are strange times. No fruit, no fragrance, blue.